I want you to hold these thoughts in mind as we go through the conversation, because then it means that I'm reinforcing something. So first of all, and they're conclusions in the sense that that's where I will arrive at the end of the discussion, but they're also my very personal perspectives on what sustainability really entails. It involves recognizing and respecting dear, I am nervous. Whew. Thank you for this exciting opportunity. Recognize and respect biophysical limits. Increasingly right now, we need to recognize that we face social and societal limits too, and those involve decisions, deliberate decisions, and many of us feel that they involve participatory decisions or democratic processes as well. And since I'm standing here in a university with a heritage, I also really want to emphasize that we need to do our very best, individually and collectively, to overcome knowledge limits, because that's an important part of sustainability too. I've been at the Stockholm Resilience Centre for 5 years, but the planetary boundaries framework and concept goes back rather further than that. The discussions had been happening for a couple of years before this very influential paper was published in 2009, led by my boss, Johan Rockström. But I really need to emphasize that it's a very interdisciplinary, international initiative. And it continues to be an interdisciplinary and international initiative. It's very much framed in biophysical terms, but the group of scientists who are involved in the workshops that led to this publication were really pooling their knowledge from many different fields and were committed to saying something to the world about where limits were being exceeded and needed attention. One of the challenges I have as a researcher in the Stockholm Resilience Centre is that often people misunderstand some of the most important messages about planetary boundaries. We don't necessarily communicate those important messages very well sometimes, but what I really want you to bear in mind is that it's like a dashboard of the biophysical processes that are happening in the world where humans are making a mess of things. They're little, I see them really as red alerts, a set of issues where our human perturbations are pushing the system outside of what we regard as its long-term functioning. Another thing I want you to really be aware of is that even though the numbers are often presented as fixed and fast, almost all of them are very rapidly changing trends right now. We're very aware, for instance, of the problems with climate and biodiversity, which we just mentioned. The little arrows that I've shown here on the red alert figures show that the vast majority of these things are still going in the wrong direction, even though we have knowledge about how they, about the impacts of these things. Another thing I really want to emphasize is that it's a global way of seeing the Earth system. It's no substitute for our local concern about local sustainability. And as I've said already, the processes that were identified and the numbers that have been set were determined by scientists in a scientific community and in our, sort of, in a sense, in our scientific ivory towers. What was their reasoning? Well, they are biophysical processes, so that's an important part of it. It's part of an effort to try to understand resilience of the system rather than individual processes as separate individual processes. It's framed in terms of risk and precaution, particularly in terms of moving into a systematic new state of the environment. And the scientists are really clear too that although they're bringing the best of their available knowledge to the questions, the decision about what is safe and unsafe is a social decision. It's a decision that involves value judgments. So I want to just explore this idea of Earth as a system, first of all. And I'm very aware that not everybody likes thinking of Earth as Gaia. That has a lot of it's been accused of being a sort of an ideology, almost a religion, but it's been a really powerful scientific hypothesis, understanding how the physical world, which is something that has been very well understood for a long time. We'll go into that in just a minute as well. And the living world are actually interacting components of a coupled system. And James Lovelock, the picture in the corner, was one of the first people who really started to propose the idea that we can think of the whole planet as the biggest unit of life, as a self-regulating system. This is how scientists have represented that system. I mean, it's not the only way, but it's been a tremendously influential way. It's called the Brotherton diagram. It was created nearly 30 years ago now. Every single yellow blob in this figure is a knowledge community. That's one way of thinking of it. So atmospheric physicists, oceanographers, terrestrial ecosystem scientists. And every single white blob on the wiring diagram is a measurement, some sort of data or flux process analysis of some sort that would allow the encoded, modeled understanding of the individual components to be coupled together into an understanding of the working of the Earth system. I always come back to this picture because it's worth knowing who's who in the Earth system science world, but also because it was such an important insight, coupling together our understanding of physical dynamics and our understanding of the living dynamics, at least as much as they can be expressed in physical terms. So I'm going to take a little moment now just to sort of talk about how we know what the Earth system is doing. We count things. And sometimes we count very tiny things like plankton, sometimes we count very big things like pixels from space, but we know the stuff that Earth is made of when we're looking at it from this global perspective. We measure the state of things. We quantify dynamic behavior. For that, you can't just observe from above or from with buckets and funnels. It requires the combination of the observational base that we have with models, and to some extent the models encode theory. But that combination allows us to understand the dynamics of planet Earth. And when we understand the dynamics, we also understand many of the gaps that we face. When we have a good enough understanding of the gaps, we might be able to sort of say, well, we can't measure what we actually want to measure, but we have data about something else. And with that knowledge, we can deduce what processes or what measurements we would want. We call those proxy measures. Some of the most well-known are things like tree rings, where you count the thickness of something and it tells you something about the climatic conditions in the past. There are loads of proxies, and it's that understanding that we've compiled now of Earth in the past that also helps us to know how strong our capacity to predict the future is and to quantify limits. When you put all of this together, we see a picture of global change. I'm going to skip through these very quickly. If any of you have questions, email me later. We're changing land cover. We're changing flows of water, surface water, groundwater, all water. Very often we're withdrawing water from water bodies on the surface in exactly the places where we're predicting that water stress will occur in future. And so we've sort of, compounding a biophysical process by our social choices too. We're changing the chemistry of the atmosphere in all sorts of ways. I really, really recommend you go and look at some of the amazing animations that are available now, really high resolution visualization of Earth observation data or model output, particularly from the visualization technology units in the USA, at UCAR and everyone else. They need all the support they can get right now. We're also changing life on Earth. We're killing life. We're changing life, we're changing ecosystems, we're even changing organisms in ways that are pretty much unprecedented. When you even get the World Bank saying we're changing life into a state unknown in human experience, then it's probably a time that all rational thinkers should at least pause to think about what that means. This is one of my favorite topics, and it's also one of the hardest to explain. We're changing the fundamental chemistry of life on Earth. We're changing the stoichiometry of the planet. When you change the chemistry, you change what life is possible. And we know that in small cases like fish tanks or ponds, but we're doing it on a global scale. This figure is about the change to the nitrogen cycle. And you'll see that it's not a map. It's a representation. Okay, part of it is that it's a conceptual representation of biogeochemical flows, but another part of it is that we're really lacking fundamental data on how we're changing the stoichiometry of the planet. There have been for 10 years now, people have been saying, wouldn't it be great to have a proper global nitrogen assessment or a nutrient assessment, just like we routinely now have global assessments for climate change and actually also for biodiversity loss. So again, if you're campaigners of any sort, pick this topic. It's about food security, it's about air quality, it's about water quality, it's about everything. And we're doing an awful lot of guesswork still when it comes to our understanding of biogeochemical change. And probably the most well-known and familiar thing to everything is Earth's physical climate. Many of us have already commented, isn't this winter weird? This is the new normal. So, to wrap up the sort of biophysical limits issue, two important things need to be sort of held on to. One is, if it were just a physical planet, quantifying limits would actually be a relatively easy, maybe expensive, maybe, technically complicated task, but it would be doable. But it's a living planet. So we're dealing with dynamic limits. When you change one thing, you change what's possible for something else. And as I've already said, the planetary boundaries framework did its very best to constrain what these dynamic limits would mean for particular moments in a particular perspective. But that global perspective has really complicated relationships to the local context. We obviously know that everything we do adds up to the global picture, but you certainly can't just drill down through the global to a pixel down at the local level and expect that that relationship will hold across space and time. Now we shift into the societal aspect. When we change all of these biophysical processes, we know that there are consequences for people. And actually, we've known this for a really long time, certainly for what I call the big four planetary boundaries. We've got comprehensive global assessments of the state of the environment for climate, for biodiversity loss, for a whole range of environmental changes. But we're not, like I say, we're still limited on some of the other things, but the constraints aren't necessarily even a lack of data. For chemical pollution, for instance, there's an awful lot of data, but it's owned by companies, and they're not always very forthcoming in sharing it publicly. So we have, again, as scientists, we only see the problem once it's a problem out in the real world, although there is information available that we could be using in more preventive, precautionary ways. For almost all of these issues too, we've already got policy structures. They're already recognized as global issues. The alphabet soup there is stuff that's really familiar to many of you, the IPCC for climate change, IPBES for biodiversity and ecosystem services. The others start to be a little bit more obscure, the Global Programme for Nutrient Management or environmental toxicology and those things. But these are policy infrastructures, policy communities talking with scientific communities, and they're there already. If we take a step back, this question of what are the societal limits, this has been a discussion that's been out there for a really long time. Probably the most famous person to talk about limits is Malthus, and I'm going to grab that bull by the horns. I'm certainly not a neo-Malthusian, but it's worth remembering some of what he was saying. A couple of hundred years ago, he argued that, everyone always talks about, the exponential growth and arithmetic growth, but his blunt message was, people will die if we continue like this. Now, I see a lot of times people say, well, Malthus was wrong. He may have well been wrong about when and how, but he wasn't totally wrong. And I think, again, that these issues come back over and over again because we need to keep having recurrent awareness that we are even if we don't know where limits are or what they are, that they will exist, even if we're not hitting them right now. A more recent study was the Limits to Growth study, which was talking not so much about people dying, but about economies dying. Even still, we need that kind of systemic analysis. And we have it. We use an awful lot of our, not just biophysical understanding, but our understanding of how societies work, our understanding of how economies work, to map out global pathways for humanity. Sometimes we're projecting climate conditions, and we can say quite a lot about what future climate impacts will be. Sometimes we're making narrative projections of what society might do. And again, that gives us a really quite concrete set of choices that we're faced with and how we need to deal with them. And so far, I've talked about global humanity as if it were one big homogeneous thing. And so again, I've got an awful lot of take-home messages for you. I think I'm on 6 now. There is no global human. Right, we are. But right now I'm really aware of the fact that in the USA there's a president who says us and them all the time. Good guys, bad guys. We are the them. We are the overconsumers. And that's a rather sobering thought, because when we talk about sustainability, we're sort of saying, well, maybe I won't buy that pair of shoes today. Humanity is immensely diverse, and it's really easy to lose that in our discussions about global sustainability, and it's impossible not to recognize it when we get down to the local level, individual choices, individual living experiences. The reason that matters is that it's our choices that make local impacts a global issue, and that make global impacts a local issue. I mean, we use the term externalities really casually when we're talking about environmental change, but our choices really do mess up someone else's local, and we now have awareness of that. We can see it from space. So we actually know what needs to be done when it comes to sustainability, and just sticking with the planetary boundaries, the ones that we've hit hard already, we need to halt the rise in CO2 emissions as urgently as possible. We need to stop releasing environmentally active substances. That might be nasty, toxic, harmful, bioaccumulative, persistent chemical substances, for instance. But it's also nice substances, essential nutrients, because, like I say, we're messing up the capability of life to make more life in ways that we can't predict. Not that prediction would make it good, for that matter, but still. Sometimes you hear yourself talking, it's a strange thing. And again, using the word footprint is such a powerful idea that, a metaphor of what we do. I'm not saying necessarily that we're very equipped yet with our footprinting tools to make an assessment, but we know when our footprint is a bad one a lot of the time. And so just make that baby step, make that first choice. Don't increase the footprint to start with, and then we can worry about stabilizing it, and then we can take the steps to minimize it, because that's what we're going to have to do if we want a sustainable planet. So now I'm going to move on to, I should have had a transition there. We know what we want to do. Why don't we do it? And the truth is, I really don't know. It's hard enough for me, with the knowledge I hold about global sustainability, to make choices that are sustainable. So again, that might be a discussion that you've got in the rest of this lecture series. But I'm going to slip smoothly on from the knowledge of the problem to the limits of our knowledge. I've pointed out how linking physics and biology, probably via chemistry in the middle, has been a really powerful tool for sustainability. I've pointed out the importance of using observations and our theoretic understanding at the same time, encoded in models. I've talked too about how we managed to integrate our understanding of the past, our understanding of the present, and a little bit our understanding of possible futures. I work in a really interdisciplinary centre in a really interdisciplinary way, so I'm still a little bit meh about the integration of social and biophysical sciences, but we know when we're doing it well, at least. But this big wide open question is, what do we do with science and society? in the orange table with all the alphabet soup, it's quite clear that we can do science talking to policy, but science and society is a much looser, organic, unpredictable thing. But it's a really important thing, and I'm going to start with just one point here. The planetary boundaries framework has really, really shown how global science is. Those of us who are trying to sort of piece together data and trying to sort of look at how we take models into real-world decision-making are really aware that global change science highlights an awful lot of global fairness issues. And I've just picked out two examples here that we happen to be looking at fairly recently. One is, where are the actual observation sites for climate and atmospheric chemistry? And this isn't a comprehensive set. There are other data bases in the world. But when you look at the single biggest collation, international collation of global data at NOAA, the vast majority of climate and atmospheric chemistry sites are in North America. Countries that are most likely to change most are desperately underobserved still. The biodiversity story is a little bit the other. Okay, that's improving now since 2013 when this was done, I'm very happy to say. But still, the vast majority of biodiversity data is in Europe because we've had the longest tradition here of gentlemen natural historians counting butterflies. May there be many more, I say. But again, the ecosystems that we know we're perturbing most are the ones where we're having to do some really elaborate guesswork or deductive modeling to piece together those pictures. And again, I really highlight places like Africa, which we know are vulnerable and we know need more knowledge. And we've got some really lovely initiatives happening, and this is sort of the positive note I want to bring forward. The reference there is actually from the Joint Global Ocean Flux Study from 10 years ago, that technology is good for understanding things, but people are more important. And I've got a whole load of sort of a little smattering of pictures. One is community-based monitoring for biodiversity. That's in global policy. Okay, it involves lots of arguments and debates about how to do it, but asking people what's happening in the ecosystem where they live is an important part of understanding the global ecosystem and how it works. I'd also encourage you to both look out for and support initiatives for citizen science. And some of them are about science communication. That's where a lot of them started. But increasingly, they're a source of data, really vital data for understanding environmental change. I'm going to highlight one that you can't really see there. No, although it does have its website there. Okay, the teabag index. One of the least constrained numbers in global carbon cycle stuff is the decomposition rate of soil organic carbon. And so if you use Lipton tea bags, you can take part in the teabag index experiment, bury your teabag in the ground, let it decompose, and then send it to the teabag index team of young scholars. They're going to have their second annual conference this year. I mean, how fantastic is that? It's data, it's young scholarship. These were PhD students when they devised it. They're using industrial standardization, the fact that a tea bag has an 8 centimeter long piece of string and a little tag on the top that lies conveniently on the surface of soil, to standardize data collection by anybody in any school, in any country, in anything. Spread it, use it, and start having that kind of genius idea about your science and bring it. I mean, it's up to the rest of us to worry about the statistical interpretation of all of these things. I'm really struck by the work of things like in the UK, and I know many other countries do this, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds gather people's pictures of birds when people don't know what birds are half the time. And we can still piece together an understanding of bird population change over time. Science is cool, I've got to say. And then what do we do with all of this knowledge? And I always come back to Martin Heyer's comment in direct response to the planetary boundaries framework, actually. He said, this idea that the planet has a cockpit, and in that cockpit we can change course. And his view is the planet just doesn't work like that. Now, I'm really relieved that on planet Earth plane, we don't have one pilot. And again, that's part of the reason I like the dashboard metaphor. Right now, we're all pushing all of the buttons in any old order, fiddling with all the knobs. It might be better if we stop pushing all the buttons simultaneously, but actually we probably can combine our knowledge to understand something about how the planet does work and how we can work with it, rather than, well, we're okay, but not them over there, for instance. And we're beginning to do just that. And this is another one of these global citizen science initiatives that has rather caught my breath in the last couple of years. The My World survey really was a global survey of what people want. I mean, okay, not everybody in the whole world had a mobile phone or access to it, but an extraordinary number of people did. And that's part of what informed the Sustainable Development Goals process. There are loads of local and international initiatives trying to sort of say, how do we club together for sustainability? One that I really enjoy at the moment is the 17goals.org, because it's got a great song but a really bad dance. So if any of you are dancer communicators, pick up 17goals.org and upload a video soon, please. When the goals first came out, I was just thinking, oh, Lord almighty, 17 goals? What's wrong with 2? Like harmony between people and nature and harmony among human beings, like in the Brundtland report. 17 goals, 169 indicators? I'm now chilling out about that because that's an unavoidable reminder of the actual real complexity of planet Earth. And just do one goal. What's your favorite? What one are you going to champion? So this is where I'm going to wrap up, actually. The knowledge limits. What are the limits of knowledge? Well, first of all, knowledge isn't choice. It's no substitute for choice. The choices you make every day, the choices we make collectively, our choices about leadership, our choices about how compliant we are with implementing global policies. Knowledge can say something about that, but it certainly doesn't act. So somehow we need to sort of close those loops, recognize that knowledge is vital for informed choice, and knowledge is vital for sensible action. And we in universities make knowledge, we argue about knowledge, we share knowledge, but somehow we need to also dip our toes into that choice and action stuff, which for many of us is really uncomfortable. The whole point of being an academic is you don't have to take action. We'd be politicians if we were that. So, on my secular sermon moment, I really, this is me speaking as a human being to you speaking as sustainability thinkers, keep asking questions about the world around us. The lovely thing about being a scientist is we're never happy with the answer. And that means that we're kind of keeping a dynamism in the context of a very dynamically changing world. I've already said take baby steps. Really do. I mean, it is difficult to change the world, but it only changes by individual action. Heaven help us if there's going to be a global transition to sustainability overnight. I want it to be by step, collectively, rather than waking up one morning to find I'm in a sustainable utopia. Take local action to make global change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Took my time.
Thank you. Thanks for all the take-home messages. There will be enough room left for questions from the audience soon, so you can take a seat now. For now, and I want to ask Gerard Roemers on stage. I'll prepare the presentation.
Yeah, got it.
You can use this.
That's good. I think the sound's on as well, so all set to go. First of all, Sarah, thank you for a really, really nice presentation and an amazing story. And also, thank you for actually sharing with the audience a lot of the issues that I would otherwise need to explain, and I think you're far better equipped to do so. So I'll just build on your story and your start. Actually, what I would like to do is to at least partially answer the question that Sarah brought forward. When you're dealing with very complex systems, systems that are not steered or governed by one person or by one organization, systems that are reacting in unexpected ways to the interventions and the choices that you're making within them, how can you still try to think about a sensible way of transitioning those systems to a sustainable state, which is, of course, what we're all here for. So to do that, I would like to first give you guys a brief overview of the theory behind this, systems thinking, and to, as a second part of my presentation, apply that to a concrete example within the food system, not to provide, let's say, the answer to that particular problem, because there is no one silver bullet solution there, but at least to provide some insight in how you can start to think about finding the proper solutions and making the proper choices when you're faced with these types of questions. So, systems thinking, the theory. Basically, the important and also tricky thing about systems is they're actually not just one thing, they're an interconnected set of elements that are organized to fulfill a certain function. And they're not organized top-down by one person to just do very simple things. They're actually grown bottom-up by all the choices that we make every day, time and time again. And for that reason, they're growing into an equilibrium, into a state that that allows them to fulfill their function. So, for example, the food system, it grows to a state where it actually can produce and provide us with food we need. But in order to do so, it needs to really, from the bottom up, be governed by lots and lots of different actors. The tricky thing is, a system can be something really small, from a cell to the earth, like Sarah just explained, to a food system, which is what we're talking about today, which really is a gigantically complex set of elements. It's all the people, the institutions, the activities, all the processes that are involved in producing the food that we consume every day. And the thing is, it's actually quite good at that. The whole system has evolved in such a way that it can fulfill that function. It can produce all the food that we need in order to survive and to thrive. And it's really been optimized in that direction. So on this graph here, you can see, well, quite a number of things, but amongst other things, you can see that in terms of actual producing tons of food, the food system has been able to triple its production in the last 50 years, whereas the land used for that production has only grown with 10, 11, 12%. So we've become a lot better at growing larger amount of foods from the same amount of land, which was highly necessary, of course, because of population growth. And that's what the system is good at doing. But the problem is that this comes at a price. The system doesn't just fulfill its function, the food system. It also fulfills a lot of functions, or it produces a lot of impact that we'd rather not see happening at all. So in terms of the biophysical boundaries that have just been discussed by Sarah, we see that the food system is in fact the largest source, ultimately, through land use changes and through the exploitation of terrestrial and marine habitats, of biodiversity loss. So this planetary boundary is crossed most by all the activities that are taking place in the food system. The annoying thing is that no one actually wants to diminish biodiversity loss, we just want to produce food. We're only not very good at actually steering all the things we have within the system at once. So we need to figure out a way how we can actually eliminate these conflicting impacts versus the impacts that we want to see happening. You can quantify these things, which is usually a big part of the work we do at Metabolic. I think it's too complicated to go into this graphic in detail, but here we've tried to show how all the different types of products and crops And fish that is produced within the food system ultimately can be traced back to biodiversity losses and land use changes. So if you want to look into these things in more detail, because I don't think there's space for it now, you can look up the research on our website. And aside from biophysical impacts, the food system also has a lot of impacts on human health and well-being on the social science front. And the funny thing is that even though the food system has tripled in terms of its absolute production, we're very bad at, first of all, distributing all this food in a proper way. So on the one hand, we have around 800 million people, apologies, growing hungry and still being undernourished, whereas on the other hand, 2 billion people, so actually double that, have problems regarding obesity. So we're not, even though we can produce, we're failing at these other things, aside from the fact that the manner in which these foods, these crops are produced is often not the most desirable thing in the world. So the labor conditions and all these other issues that you're well aware of are also happening within the same food system. So what we would like to do, of course, is to try and trim these side effects, these negative impacts, and to see if we can change this system to not just fulfill its function in terms of food production, but also do that within the safe operating space, biophysically speaking, and adjust and social operating space, socially speaking. And that's a bit the idea that I want to give you guys today, is to find a way to think about this in a constructive way. So I don't have the answer of how to transition the whole food system, but I want to provide at least a framework for researching and for thinking on how to do these types of things. So very simply put, you can look at a system at 4 levels. And what happens a lot in policy making, in media, in your day-to-day life is that you'll see the tip of the iceberg. You'll see the events that are taking place in the food system. So on the news you will see Africa going hungry, or you can see in the Netherlands a big discussion on the manure problems or these types of things, but they are symptoms of the system, and they are caused by the processes within it, the deeper structures economically or physically within it, and ultimately the mental paradigms that are at the bottom of all that. So to provide an example, non-food related, but perhaps a bit more clear, you have always the discussion in the Netherlands on traffic jams and how to solve those. So the solution that's often propagated in this regard is to expand the road system. And from a systems perspective, that really doesn't make all that much sense, because in fact, what you see, and this has been going on for years, is that the structures in the system in terms of traffic are not addressed that way. So you can build more roads, but that might actually cause more people to take to the road on their cars, because even if it works, if you have more roads and it's easier to travel and you reach your destinations faster, it becomes more attractive to travel by car. And you can see these roads filling up again, and so you'll need to build new roads time and time again, keep expanding. Whereas perhaps the more structural issue that you'd like to address is the spatial planning in a society. The reason why people travel on these roads so much is because their houses are not near their work, because of the economic structures, because of the infrastructure. So you'd want to try and get to these issues rather than simply solving the symptoms that you see at the end of the pipeline. And I think that's also the red thread going through the lecture series. So a lot of these structural causes of unsustainability are incorporated in the series as a whole. The poverty trap is going to be discussed in more depth, I think. And there's a range of others. I think there's also a lecture included on the monopolies of big corporates in the food chains, for example, and the consequences that these types of economic or power consolidations actually have for the way in which our food is produced and for the control that we can also exert on it. And I think these are very important issues to tackle, even though they are very complicated. So just to elaborate a little bit on this example, if you have companies like, for example, Monsanto controlling almost 20% of all seed production or 90% of all soy seed production, then it's going to be very hard if you want to change something in those production chains to do that if you can't get these corporates on board. Whereas at the same time, it might not be in their interest at all to do so. The same goes for food trading, which is largely consolidated with 4 big companies. They have 90% of the wheat markets, for example. For pesticides and for chemical fertilizers, you see similar numbers, where just a handful of companies own half of the market. And that means that if you don't take these structures into account, which are, of course, only they're the third level down in this way of thinking, but if you don't think about that level, then it's very likely that the system will push back whatever change you're trying to achieve. So that's the same with, I think later on in the lecture series, there's also, I don't know his name, I think Jan Luiten, who's addressing growth as a paradigm and how that can actually steer unsustainable behavior. Well, this is an example of how that plays out in the food system, where it's not about economic growth per se, but the paradigm has been for a long time that you need to grow more food on the same amount of land. Higher yields per hectare. Higher yields per hectare, however, have usually been framed in tons of food or the calories that you need to produce. And so a lot of the discussion in society and in politics and even in science has been around how can we get more calories off of this same parcel of land time and time again. And the consequence of that has been intensification and the whole rise of an agro-industrial cluster. But it might just be that you're asking the question wrong. You can be optimizing for calories per hectare, whereas perhaps you want to optimize for nutritional value per hectare. There's no necessity per se to, for example, double food production by 2050 in terms of tons if you would make smarter choices in the types of crops that you're going to produce, or if you would reduce the land you use indirectly or directly for animal products and spend that on, for example, legumes or pulses, which in fact, even by a very crude measurement here in this graph, which is just protein per hectare, but per ton, but you can already see from this that if you do that and you phase out grains and you phase out animal products for a bit, you could do quite well with the same amount of land in terms of nutritional value. So what I'm trying to say here is that even this fifth level here, which might seem very abstract and conceptual and academic, a mental model of thinking about what an efficient food system is like, has tremendous consequences. Because if we're actually quite good in optimizing calories or tons per hectare, but we haven't, maybe you're just optimizing in the wrong direction. Maybe you want to have close the nutritional gap rather than a food gap or a calorie gap. So those are a few examples of the structures that you can see in the food system that are behind a lot of the problems and the problematic impacts that we want to address. And the funny thing is that, in fact, we've known how these types of things work. Hey, this is an old presentation, I think. Okay, we'll just go with this one. We know how these types of patterns evolve in the system, actually for quite a long time. They're called system archetypes, and I'll show you an example in a minute. And they are predictable patterns of behavior. So some of them are really quite well known, and they arise in a lot of different systems. I think probably you've heard of the limits of growth or the tragedy of the commons. Who is the term system archetype? Is that something that anybody knows, or is this completely new? Who's heard of that? Can I have a show of hands? Just one? Two? And tragedy of the commons, is that also completely alien? Should I explain that? Or also very little? A very diverse crowd. So in the newer presentation, I had a picture here that actually explains one of these types of predictable patterns of unsustainable behavior, which is the tragedy of the commons. And the picture was very simple fisheries, so it was a big load of fish that was caught. And that's a classic example of a devastation of natural resources that everyone knows will occur, but that still happens because individual interest is to deplete this resource, and there's no means to actually coordinate collectively stopping to harvest. So just there's a very simple game about this. If you have a pond full of fish, and you have 4 fishermen, for example, that they have access to this pond, and you want to maximize your profits, then the best thing as a fisherman individually is to just keep catching as much as you can. And even when you see fish populations going down, you will keep doing this, because if you don't, then the fisherman next to you will, or the other one. And so in the end, you'll have a race to the bottom where everyone sees it coming, that your natural resources, your fish population gets completely depleted, and in the long run, you won't have any way to make a living out of that. But because of the dynamics in the group, you will still see that this is actually exactly how it plays out. So there's a lot of different examples of these types of patterns within the food system, and I want to just discuss one to show how you can think practically about finding true sustainable solutions for these types of questions. And the example I want to give is fertilizer use. So chemical fertilizers are very widely used in the food system to actually get to these high yields. So we tripled in tons per hectare, but we also quadrupled in the fertilizers that we use in 50 years. And if you're translating that behavior into a systems diagram, this is what it looks like. And it's quite easy to explain from this diagram why we keep using so much chemical fertilizers. So the reason we're initially starting to use fertilizers is because it gets us these higher yields, which is what we want. The problem, though, is that when you're using nitrogen, phosphorus on your land for crop production, you have no proper way of dosing it, so you will overuse, and a lot of it will enter either the land or the water, so the ecosystem. And for example, soil fertility, if you have a surplus of nitrogen that goes into it, then it goes down. You have acidification because bacteria turn the ammonia into nitrates. You have carbon that is bound by this excess of nitrogen. So by using fertilizers, you will get a short-term yield gain, but a long-term decrease of your soil's fertility, which is, of course, a very good reason to use more fertilizers, because you want to keep upping your yields. So this archetype is called addiction, and it happens a lot. You're getting addicted to a short-term fix, but at the same time, this solution is creating your long-term problem. So what you can see from this is that a farmer won't stop using fertilizers once he's in this cycle, because his need to do so actually keeps increasing as he goes with every turn. So these are quite difficult problems, because I cannot simply start taxing fertilizer. The interest of a farmer to do this is a lot is too high. I would really have to become I would have to do a really, really high tax and get him bankrupt almost, like, and otherwise his economic incentive is to keep doing this. So we're trying to find ways that, even though we know this pattern of behavior will arise, we can think about how you might want to change it. And then basically you can do this in 3 steps. First, you want to think about the impacts that you want to change. In this case, I've already made the choice, the fertilizer use. Then you want to look where in the system you want to intervene, so the processes. And then you want to think about how to actually change those processes, the interventions themselves. Yeah, I didn't have this slide in. So if you're prioritizing what you want to change, forget about the whole right side of the thing, of the text. It's too much information anyway, but from the left side you can see 3 important things to keep in mind when you want to reduce environmental impacts. The first is that you want to reverse long-term irreversible impacts. So if there's tipping points in the system, like the 2 degrees climate change that you don't want to start happening because then you can't control the process, then you want to step away from those. Second is impacts that undermine the safe operating space for humanity. So that's where the planetary boundaries come in handy, because they've actually given us a quantified framework for estimating how far we are beyond that. And then third is the impact that we actually don't know how to predict the gravity of. So the processes that have outcomes that are highly unpredictable, you want to better be safe than sorry. So if you do this, then you could already see from Sarah's story that biogeochemical flows, they are far beyond what the planet is able to bear. So they've been crossed 200, 250%, depending on phosphorus or nitrogen. And that provides a good reason for actually changing this process that is behind that, largely, which is the use of fertilizers. But in line with the 4 levels of thinking model, we would like to not just look at the actual outcomes, so for example, soil degradation, or if you have dead zones, for example, in marine, if you get a lot of fertilizers in a marine environment, it leads to algae bloom, eutrophication, and the extinction of a lot of aquatic animals. So there's a lot of outcomes, end of pipe events that you'd want to prevent. But what we would like to do is to see if we can go lower than that, so really get to the structure of the system, and see, for example, if we can do something about the influence of agricultural production methods on the fertility of soils, and in that way actually make it unnecessary to use these chemical fertilizers, to see if we can go a bit deeper. And then a third step that you want to do, if you're actually looking at the types of interventions that you want to use. So for example, if you want to really think about how you can actually prevent the use of chemical fertilizers, then we've just seen from this model that taxing it, for example, putting a price on fertilizer use, might not be so effective, because there's a lot of incentives within the system that even at a price people will use it. But instead you might want to go to a more radical solution. So really think about new symbiotic agricultural systems that provide you both with high yields, but at the same time don't reduce your soil fertility, because they're not dependent on fertilizers. You can think about closed loop systems that are maybe not even soil dependent at all. So there's aquaponics, hydroponics, urban agricultural systems that do not actually need soils to grow foods in. They can be highly productive. And it's these types of solutions that are perhaps more promising if you're chasing structural change rather than just temporarily mitigating some end-of-pipe impacts or events. So just a few concrete examples of what you could do if you really want to change the dynamics of the systems. Polycropping, so now we have a lot of monocultures that are highly dependent on continuous influx of nutrients, of nitrogen, of phosphorus, but you can also find systems that use a bit of biomimicry, let's say, to create almost an ecosystem within your agricultural production system that allows for different sets of crops to be grown so that you can maintain soil fertility in a natural way. You can also try and address the R&D complex and the knowledge and the institutional lock-ins that are behind fertilizer use. So now we need to use fertilizers a lot, also in part because we use crops that you have to harvest, deroot, and sow again every year, but you also have perennial crops that you could actually just harvest and leave for a number of years. This allows you to not plow the earth, and it allows you to reduce topsoil losses and therefore increase fertility. So this is a very promising solution, but the whole agri-industrial cluster that we have that's geared towards short-term efficiency has actually never focused on these types of perennials. So you need, all the crops that we're using at the moment, they are with these annual cycles, and you would need to actually invest in a whole research trajectory to also get the perennial crops that are there up to the right level of productivity. These are an example of the soilless systems that I already talked about, and the interesting thing here is that with an aquaponic system like this, you can completely control the nutrients inflow but also outflow. There are no losses. You can just close the system yourself, and therefore you'll reduce all of the negative impacts that I've just discussed. And a bit more futuristic perhaps, but you can also think about creating these types of closed loop systems in an urban environment where actually a large part of the resource that you need for these fertilizers, phosphorus, is concentrated in the form of our excrement. Actually, your pee is the second most concentrated phosphorus mine aside from just digging it out of the rocks. So in the future, we're going to have to do something with that agglomeration of fertilizers. And you can think of entirely closed-loop systems that have a multitude of products in them that don't come with the whole set of side impacts that we've just discussed. So you can also start to, even though it seems maybe a bit more distant, see if you can really find a fundamentally different way of producing your food and to make that more sustainable. So I guess to close off, this is just one example, and it's not like from this one example and going through this one thought experiment, you will have all the solutions for the fertilizer problem, let alone for a whole set of other impacts that you will have to address if you want to create a truly sustainable food system. But this way of drawing out the dynamics of a system and trying to pinpoint how the system might push back or reinforce a certain change or intervention that you're trying to put into it can be a really helpful tool if you want to see whether your interventions and your ideas for creating a more sustainable food system will actually have a good effect on the long term as well. So I think it's a very useful thought experiment to go through with different issues. And I hope that in the other lectures in this series you will be able to use this way of thinking to also see what you find truly promising solutions and to make sure that you address the structure and the patterns of behavior that are actually deeper within the system rather than the events that you might want to change immediately, because that's the better way of creating, let's say, a lasting and structural change within the food system. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Sarah, I would like to invite you, please. Oh, Gerard, do also stay on stage. You're very welcome here. Because I was wondering, you showed us this model of this structure where the mental models were at the bottom, this triangle where the mental models were at the bottom.
Yeah.
Is that the place where we can make the most change? Like we have the most we can win is at the mental model level.
Ultimately, you're going to have to change that if you, because it translates to everything else you do within the system. So I really think that if you look at the development of the food system in the past 50 years, it's been guided by, and rightfully so also in part because that needed to happen. We needed to have a green revolution and to increase production to keep it in tandem with population growth. But you can see that this very dominant mental model of chasing profits in the short term for some companies, but also more, less selfish, but just efficiency for food production while being aware that we have limited land to do so, that's created a one-dimensional way of optimizing the system. And it's been, one of the root causes, I think, of all the other social and biophysical side effects that you see that are everyone agrees on that are undesirable, but that come with a system that's completely geared towards efficiency and effectiveness.
Do you think it's possible to change that?
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to change entirely. If you think about new agricultural systems like aquaponics, hydroponics, polycultures that you can really think about in different layers of production systems, complementary in terms of the food, the nutrients that your crops will need. All these things are not fluffy, let's say, hippie type of like back to nature solutions. They can actually also combine this efficiency thinking, creating highly productive technological systems that are sustainable. So we just need to add to our objectives, and we need to make sure that we get an integrated function for the food system rather than a one-dimensional one.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, you were talking about we need to zoom out, actually, get a little bit away from the cockpit, and but at the same time, you were saying that it's the individual that needs to take action, or where action needs to start. Do you see any connections with the model Gerard proposed?
Oh, definitely, yes. I mean, it was... yes. I think, I mean, one of the challenges we face when we talk about systems very often is that it does depersonalize things. So even when we're talking about, I mean, I think it is really useful to sort of unpack the layers of the system, because people are making choices in that system. I mean, even now when we talk about the food system, we have, it isn't one system even now, and again, that's sort of what you were saying as well. In terms of interactive audiences, how many of you grow basil on your kitchen windowsills? Yeah, look, I got loads of hands. You know, I think we are active in our systems in all sorts of different ways. And again, that means that we've got, again, back to use the language of intervention points and leverage, we have leverage in lots of different ways. Now, every one of us has leverage to some extent over our own little world. Some of us have got a lot of leverage over much bigger systems as well. And that is its own complexity. And again, we don't want that to be over-engineered and over-optimized, because that, we know from thousands of years of human history, is probably not a good way to design society. But at the same time, we need to recognize these sort of little cogs and circles within circles that enable us to make some sense of direction and purpose.
Yeah. And like a simple question maybe to pose, maybe not to answer, but are you optimistic?
Half the time.
You, Gerard?
Yeah, I never really think in those terms. I find it, because it's, I mean, so because these questions are very complicated and the solutions are usually not there, or even though we've been looking for quite a while, it's just very interesting. So regardless of whether I would be a hyper pessimist or very positive, I just find it a nice intellectual challenge to keep thinking about these things. And, you know, if I'm, let's say, it's a bit of a weird example, but if I'm driving towards a cliff in a car, I'd rather just try and steer left and see if I can get away from it. It's the best thing you can do. It's the most fun thing you can do.
Better die
it's
fighting.
the most rewarding. So, yeah.
Right,
and
so
I don't think
matter.
that'll happen.
Yeah.
I think we'll figure it out. There's a lot of amazing technology and innovations that we haven't even begun to utilize. So I'm not pessimistic about it at all. But yeah, it's almost irrelevant, because it's just very interesting to see if you can create more sustainable and more optimal systems. And yeah, that's where most of the reward lies, I think.
Right. Thanks. I'm gonna go to the audience now. Are there any questions in the audience?
Pick the local ones.
Yeah. I'll come to you.
I have a question for Gerard. I was wondering, in 2050, we have to increase calorie production by 70%. Have you an idea of how we are going to sustain the quality of food with this high request of increase?
So we have to increase chemical production?
No, calories. The
Oh,
amount of
calorie, yeah,
calories.
exactly. So it's slightly less bad than that. I think they've, at the FAO, also revised, let's say, that to, I think, 60 by just by heart. Yeah, I think that relates to the picture that I showed earlier of all the different types of food crops that you can use. There's a really interesting report of the World Resource Institute where they've tried to calculate the nutritional gap rather than the caloric gap. And that's a lot smaller. That's something like 20%. So I think there's also a lot of efficiency to be gained in terms of what we produce. And then there's also, of course, food losses, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not a given that we have to double our food production. We just have to create a much smarter system that produces a different variety of things rather than just double everything we're doing now, I think.
Would you give that more priority than to say, well, motivate or stimulate people to consume less?
No, do both. I mean, first of all, always reduce, like, if I would have to do a hierarchy, I would say reduce the need for technology and for producing new things as much as possible is always the first step. And then the second thing is to try and find synergetic or sustainable supply solutions. But yeah, if you can prevent from having to do something in the first place, that's always the most sustainable thing. So yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question for Sarah. I've heard you mention safe operating spaces, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on what those are in relation to the limits.
One of the things that I find really interesting is how phrases, words catch attention. So, I mean, things like footprints, you know, it has a nice metaphoric ring to it. It means we can understand something that we couldn't understand before. Planetary boundaries is another one. Tipping points is another one. You think, oh, you know, what does that really mean? Safe operating space is a technical engineering term, and we're using it for a planetary process. I happen to like it better, actually, than planetary boundaries for lots of reasons. One is a large part of my own previous research is on risk research. How do we understand and configure risk? And so describing an operating space as safe also means that I have much, from a researcher perspective, I can bring in a really rich sort of body of knowledge and expertise on risk understanding, risk management, risk awareness, whereas planetary boundaries is one great big number in a whole load of units that most people don't use, and it becomes a much harder thing to translate. Right now, almost all of our research conversations are actually science-society conversations. The word operating in operating space implies that we can make choices, implies that we are actually operating something, that we're twiddling knobs or that we're optimizing something to some extent. And again, I warn against that because for precisely the reasons you're saying, there's a kind of a hubris in thinking you're fixing something when actually you're very effectively breaking something else. But by focusing on the space within which we can operate, within which societies can continue to function, within which households can continue to be, that again is a more empowering and opportunity opening way of talking about living within limits. One of my close friends and colleagues is Kate Rayworth. Many of you may have heard of the Oxfam donut, the idea that, yes, we need to live within biophysical limits in some sense, but we also have social foundations. We don't want to live in conditions of social despair or degradation or deprivation. So an operating space also needs to have this social perspective, and that isn't particularly well articulated in either of the two sort of core planetary boundaries articles, but it's absolutely vital to the way that we translate that into everyday life.
Is that all right for you? Yeah, you can add something if you want.
If you look at like climate change or biodiversity loss, or the graph you had where you have the issues, where you state them on a biophysical, chemical, planetary commons kind of use, when it comes to policy, it's only dealt with in a way of institutions. And those two don't always connect, if you know what I mean.
I know. And I think that's one of the frustrating things that people keep saying, why don't governments do this, or why doesn't this and that happen? How do we change the world? And for me, the really striking thing is that we've had 100 and something years of understanding about what carbon dioxide does to the atmosphere. We've had decades now of policy on climate, biodiversity, desertification, and actually on things like long-range transboundary pollution. That one's not too bad, actually. We're doing okay on that. But probably because it hits people where they are, rather than hitting somebody else somewhere else in a different place and time. But the biggest issue is the implementation gap. Again, for almost all of these things, we've got beautifully crafted policy with really strong agreement that something needs to be done, and it's just not quite done enough. If any of you want to help me write this paper, I've been wanting to write a paper called Tracking Our Own Decline for a really long time. Partly looking at things like the Living Planet Index that year after year after year says we're making things worse for ourselves. So there you go. Anyone helping me write?
Really? You also talked about, you said it's more about what do we do with science and society, and maybe that has a little bit to do with this. And you mentioned some initiatives, but are those initiatives like? Is it nice that they are done and like good examples of how it could be, or do you really think they have enough power to make a change?
I know they have enough power to make a change. Now, how big a change is still an open question. I hate to sound like a Darwinian on this, but I think we're going to have to do an awful lot of experimenting and failing before we succeed in some ways. And that's true for the way that we try to understand the global dynamics of a whole planet and still be fair to the people in that planet. It's also the case that the world is changing as we watch. The technology that we can access is changing as we watch. So we're going to be experimenting with different ways of getting this. One very tangible example was I've been doing some work on Arctic change recently with the Arctic Council. And a couple of years ago, the Russian government removed their indigenous persons representative from the process. They said, we're all Russians, we don't need all this sort of social diversity in our, no indigenous people need special representation. What a silly idea. And the biggest response didn't come from the other Arctic Council nations because they're locked into the political negotiations with Russia. I mean, even though they have commitments to protecting the rights of their indigenous people under international law as well. The biggest reaction came from Twitter world in Latin America. The indigenous peoples all around the world said this needs attention, and that was what mobilized the change. So again, change responses come from the least expected places as well, and that's one of the things that gives me optimism.
So we need to keep trying.
Keep tweeting.
Yeah, keep tweeting and keep trying. Other questions? No one, yeah, there in the front. Thank you.
Hi, this one is for Gerard. Did you say during your talk that we should all try going vegan?
Well, I would be. I think the biggest thing you can do personally, if you really want to create a more sustainable food system, is at the very least drastically cut your meat. I have a meat consumption. I haven't done it yet, but I wanted to actually start to calculate what a sensible meat budget would be per person. Since we know how many sort of marginal grasslands there are, you could do a back of the envelope thing. We're eating way too much of it, and it's ridiculous how much, I don't know the numbers exactly, they're in the report, but it's like a third or something of the crops that we produce, we just feed to animals that then are very inefficient in producing food that we like better, but when you're talking about nutritional content, it's not the most effective thing to do this with 3 steps in between. So yeah, I think that's a very important thing you can do on a personal level. Definitely, if not vegan or vegetarian, at least, I don't know, cut it in half for this year as a sort of very late New Year's resolution. It's the biggest impact by far on a lot of issues. Climate change, biodiversity loss, it's huge, so yeah.
Are there people that already started to cut down on their meat consumption because of sustainable living?
Clap the hands.
I guess so.
Also,
See,
while we're at it,
small intervention.
While we're at it, and since we're in the Netherlands, please try and also drop on the dairy a little bit, and maybe think about alternatives because it's huge. You can also cut your impact in 4 just by switching even to soy milk rather than cow dairy.
All right, thanks for this very practical tip. Any other questions?
Just don't
Over
stop
here.
the chocolate.
In the back.
Keep that.
Let me see, where was that hand? Over here, yeah.
Half a year ago, I started cutting fish and meat out of my diet. And recently I've been thinking about starting to eat vegan. And I wonder how, if you know, what results or what difference it would make for the environment if like more people would do so, because I question the alternatives for meat, or if they're like more sustainable for the world.
Hmm. Do you want
Are
a
the
quantified answer? That's difficult. But I mean, one example I know coincidentally, because I looked into it recently just for personal reasons, is switching from cow milk to, for example, soy milk. It makes a factor 3 or 4 difference. If that's just pulling out some life cycle analysis studies, so they're not like context specific, time and place, and there's a lot of ifs and buts, but it gives you an order of magnitude idea. So I think it's safe to say that it can save a lot of impacts in terms of climate change and biodiversity. But I would never be dogmatic about it.
And I think that's, I mean, they've just left. There are some people here in the room who really do an awful lot of that analysis. But I think, like lots of things, it isn't just what you do, it's the way that you do it. So my sort of comment about chocolate, actually, I've been a little bit more serious about that now. It really does depend what you eat and how you eat it. We've got a group of researchers at the Stockholm Resilience Centre right now exploring the idea of gourmet landscapes. Because
sorry, what was it?
Gourmet landscapes. So, you know, yes, in a place where there's a huge reliance on cows, it makes sense to encourage people to move on to vegetable-based milks of some sort. But at the same time, you wouldn't want entire fields just of soy. So landscape, you know, we can build in the diversity and the complexity to our ecosystems in many ways too. And sometimes that might mean sheep or goats. There's a lovely initiative in Bristol, a city where I used to live, called Street Goat. So if any of you are into urban farms, get adventurous, have a go with that.
Yeah. And also, it's if you really want to think these things through, it's also it's a bit of a joke to, well, it's not, I would be interested, but to make a meat budget per person. But there's definitely a place for cattle and dairy in a sustainable food system. It's just that we're moving it too much in one direction, and it would be really good to actually start sitting down and saying, okay, so how much land do we have that's not suitable for crops? Let's at least then use that for cattle, let's say. This is very black and white, but that's that type of thinking, and actually making data-driven, scientifically based decisions rather than just, you know, what we've been doing all along. I think that could make a very big difference.
Your Metabolic is advising, for instance, the WWF, but are there also like governments listening to your story?
Yeah, on food systems.
Or policymakers?
Yeah. Let me see what's a good. We've just done, so there's probably, as a lot of people from the Netherlands at least will know, Brabant has a lot of, the Dutch province of Brabant in the south has a very intensive farming system. And they're well aware of that, and they're also eager to change and innovate in the right direction. So it's in that case not even the government, although the province is also backing it, but even just the company and the private sector that is asking for a way out and a way to transition this to a circular and a sustainable state. So yeah, it's not just NGOs and the environmentalists.
Very good to hear.
Yeah.
Any other questions here? I thought there was another one in the back. I'm not sure. No. Someone else? So if there's no last question, no one? All right, so I think we'll just leave it at that then. So Gerard Roemers and Sarah Cornell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.